The Final Assault, from High Adventure by Edmund Hillary. I watched our support party disappear down the ridge and then turned to examine our campsite more closely. It wasn't really much of a place. Above us was a rock cliff, black and craggy, but at least devoid of loose stones to fall on us. From the foot of the cliff, a little snow slope ran at an easy angle for 8 or 9 feet to the top of the steep and exposed south face of the mountain. This little slope was to be our campsite. It was certainly far from flat, and it was to need a lot of work on it before we could possibly pitch a tent. We carefully moved all the gear to one side, and then set to work with our ice axes to remove the surface snow off a reasonably large area. 10 inches down, we struck rock, and after an hour's work, we had cleared an area about 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. The slope underneath was made up of stones and rubble, all firmly glued together with ice. This was much harder going. With the picks on our ice axes, we chopped away at the slope, prizing out the separate stones and scraping away the rubble. But our progress was very slow. We weren't using any oxygen at all, but we found we could work very hard indeed for periods of 10 minutes or so. Then we'd have to stop and have a short rest. With the debris we chopped out of the slope, we tried to build up the platform on the downhill side, but almost invariably saw it collapse and go roaring down over the bluffs below. At times we were buffeted by wind and snow, yet we worked doggedly on, knowing that our tent was our only chance of survival against the rigors of the night. At 6:30 a.m. we crawled slowly out of the tent and stood on our little ledge. Already the upper part of the mountain was bathed in sunlight. It looked warm and inviting, but our ledge was dark and cold. We lifted our oxygen onto our backs and slowly connected up the tubes to our face masks. My 30-pound load seemed to crush me downward and stifled all enthusiasm. But when I turned on the oxygen and breathed it deeply, the burden seemed to lighten, and the old urge to get to grips with the mountain came back. We strapped on our crampons and tied on our nylon rope, grasped our ice axes, and were ready to go. I looked at the way ahead. From our tent, very steep slopes covered with deep powder snow led up to a prominent snow shoulder on the southeast ridge about 100 feet above our heads. The slopes were in the shade, and breaking trail was going to be cold work. Still a little worried about my boots, I asked Tenzing to lead off. Always willing to do his share, and more than his share if necessary, Tenzing scrambled past me and tackled the slope. With powerful thrusts of his legs, he forced his way up in knee-deep snow. I gathered in the rope and followed along behind him. We were climbing out over the tremendous south face of the mountain, and below us snow chutes and rock ribs plummeted thousands of feet down to the western combe. Starting in the morning straight on to exposed climbing is always trying on the nerves, and this was no exception. In imagination, I could feel my heavy load dragging me backward down the great slopes below. I seemed clumsy and unstable, and my breath was hurried and uneven. But Tenzing was pursuing an irresistible course up the slope, and I didn't have time to think too much. My muscles soon warmed up to their work, my nerves relaxed, and I dropped into the old climbing rhythm, and followed steadily up his tracks. As we gained a little height, we moved into the rays of the sun, and although we could feel no appreciable warmth, we were greatly encouraged by its presence. Taking no rests, Tenzing plowed his way up through the deep snow and led out onto the snow shoulder. We were now at a height of 28,000 feet. Towering directly above our heads was the south summit, steep and formidable, and to the right were the enormous cornices of the summit ridge. We still had a long way to go. Ahead of us the ridge was sharp and narrow, but rose at an easy angle. I felt warm and strong now, so I took over the lead. First I investigated the ridge with my ice axe. On the sharp crest of the ridge, and on the right-hand side, loose powder snow was lying dangerously over hard ice. Any attempt to climb on this would only produce an unpleasant slide down toward the Kangshung Glacier. But the left-hand slope was better. It was still rather steep, but it had a firm surface of wind-blown powder snow, into which our crampons would bite readily. Taking every care, I moved along onto the left-hand side of the ridge. Everything seemed perfectly safe. With increased confidence, I took another step. Next moment, I was almost thrown off balance, as the wind crust suddenly gave way, and I sank through it up to my knee. It took me a little while to regain my breath. Then I gradually pulled my leg out of the hole. I was almost upright again when the wind crust under the other foot gave way, and I sank back with both legs enveloped in soft, loose snow to the knees. It was the mountaineer's curse, breakable crust. I forced my way along. Sometimes for a few careful steps I was on the surface, but usually the crust would break at the critical moment and I'd be up to my knees again. Though it was tiring and exasperating work, I felt I had plenty of strength in reserve. For half an hour I continued on in this uncomfortable fashion, with the violent balancing movement I was having to make completely destroying rhythm and breath. It was a great relief when the snow condition improved, and I was able to stay on the surface. I still kept down on the steep slopes on the left of the ridge, but plunged ahead and climbed steadily upward. I came over a small crest and saw in front of me a tiny hollow on the ridge, and in this hollow lay 2 oxygen bottles, almost completely covered with snow. It was Evans and Bourdillon's dump. I rushed forward into the hollow and knelt beside them. Wrenching one of the bottles out of its frozen bed, I wiped the snow off its dial. It showed 1,000 pounds pressure. It was nearly a third full of oxygen. I checked the other, and it was the same. This was great news. It meant that the oxygen we were carrying on our backs only had to get us back to these bottles instead of right down to the South Col. It gave us more than another hour of endurance. I explained this to Tenzing through my oxygen mask. I don't think he understood, but he realized I was pleased about something and nodded enthusiastically. I led off again. I knew there was plenty of hard work ahead, and Tenzing could save his energies for that. The ridge climbed on upward rather more steeply now, and then broadened out and shot up at a sharp angle to the foot of the enormous slope running up to the south summit. I crossed over onto the right-hand side of the ridge and found the snow was firm there. I started chipping a long line of steps up to the foot of the great slope. Here we stamped out a platform for ourselves, and I checked our oxygen. Everything seemed to be going well. I had a little more oxygen left than Tenzing, which means I was obtaining a slightly lower flow rate from my set, but it wasn't enough to matter, and there was nothing I could do about it anyway. Ahead of us was a really formidable problem, and I stood in my steps and looked at it. Rising from our feet was an enormous slope, slanting deeply down onto the precipitous east face of Everest, and climbing up with appalling steepness to the south summit of the mountain, 400 feet above us. The left-hand side of the slope was a most unsavory mixture of steep, loose rock and snow, which my New Zealand training immediately regarded with grave suspicion, but which in actual fact the rock-climbing Britons, Evans and Bourdillon, had ascended in much trepidation when on the first assault. The only other route was up the snow itself, and still, fairly discernible here and there, were traces of the track made by the first assault party, who had come down it in preference to their line of ascent up the rocks. The snow route it was for us. There looked to be some tough work ahead, and as Tenzing had been taking it easy for a while, I hard-heartedly waved him through. With his first 6 steps, I realized that the work was going to be much harder than I had thought. His first 2 steps were on top of the snow, the third was up to his ankles, and by the 6th, he was up to his hips. But almost lying against the steep slope, he drove himself onward, plowing a track directly upward. Even following in his steps was hard work, for the loose snow refused to pack into safe steps. After a long and valiant spell, he was plainly in need of a rest, so I took over. Immediately, I realized that we were on dangerous ground. On this very steep slope, the snow was soft and deep with little coherence. My ice axe shaft sank into it without any support, and we had no form of a belay. The only factor that made it at all possible to progress was a thin crust of frozen snow which tied the whole slope together. But this crust was a poor support. I was forcing my way upward, plunging deep steps through it, when suddenly, with a dull breaking noise, an area of crust all around me, about 6 feet in diameter, broke off into large sections and slid with me back through 3 or 4 steps. And then I stopped, but the crust, gathering speed, slithered on out of sight. It was a nasty shock. My whole training told me that the slope was exceedingly dangerous. But at the same time, I was saying to myself, Ed, my boy, this is Everest. You've got to push it a bit harder. My solar plexus was tight with fear as I plowed on. Halfway up, I stopped, exhausted. I could look down 10,000 feet between my legs, and I've never felt more insecure. Anxiously, I waved Tenzing up to me. What do you think of it, Tenzing? And the immediate response, very bad, very dangerous. Do you think we should go on? And there came the familiar reply that never helped you much, but never let you down. Just as you wish. I waved him on to take a turn at leading. Changing the lead much more frequently now, we made our unhappy way upward, sometimes sliding back and wiping out half a dozen steps, and never feeling confident that at any moment the whole slope might not avalanche. In the hope of some sort of a belay, we traversed a little toward the rocks, but found no help in their smooth, holdless surface. We plunged on, then, upward. And then I noticed that a little above us, the left-hand rock ridge turned into snow, and the snow looked firm and safe. Laboriously and carefully, we climbed across some steep rock, and I sank my ice axe shaft into the snow of the ridge. It went firm and hard. The pleasure of this safe belay, after all the uncertainty below, was like a reprieve to a condemned man. Strength flowed into my limbs, and I could feel my tense nerves and muscles relaxing. I swung my ice axe at the slope and started chipping a line of steps upward. It was very steep, but seemed so gloriously safe. Tenzing, an inexpert but enthusiastic step cutter, took a turn and chopped a haphazard line of steps up another pitch. We were making fast time now, and the slope was starting to ease off. Tenzing gallantly waved me through, and with a growing feeling of excitement, I cramponed up some firm slopes to the rounded top of the south summit. It was only 9 a.m. With intense interest, I looked at the vital ridge leading up to the summit, the ridge about which Evans and Bourdillon had made such gloomy forecasts. At first glance, it was an exceedingly impressive and indeed a frightening sight. In the narrow crest of this ridge, the base of rock of the mountain had a thin capping of snow and ice that reached out over the east face in enormous cornices, overhanging and treacherous, and only waiting for the careless foot of the mountaineer to break off and crash 10,000 feet into the Kangshung Glacier. And from the cornices, the snow dropped steeply to the left to merge with the enormous rock bluffs, which towered 8,000 feet above the western Kum. It was impressive, all right. But as I looked, my fears started to lift a little. Surely I could see a route there? For this snow slope on the left, although very steep and exposed, was practically continuous for the first half of the ridge, although in places the great cornices reached hungrily across. If we could make a route along that snow slope, we could go quite a distance at least. With a feeling almost of relief, I set to work with my ice axe and cut a platform for myself just down off the top of the south summit. Tenzing did the same, and then we removed our oxygen sets and sat down. The day was still remarkably fine, and we felt no discomfort through our thick layers of clothing from either wind or cold. We had a drink out of Tenzing's water bottle, and then I checked our oxygen supplies. Tenzing's bottle was practically exhausted, but mine still had a little in it. As well as this, we each had a full bottle. I decided that the difficulties ahead would demand as light a weight on our backs as possible, so determined to use only the full bottles. I removed Tenzing's empty bottle and my nearly empty one, and laid them in the snow. With particular care, I connected up our last bottles and tested to see that they were working efficiently. The needles on the dials were steady on 3,300 pounds per square inch pressure. They were very full bottles, holding just over 800 liters of oxygen each. At 3 liters a minute, we consumed 180 liters an hour, and this meant a total endurance of nearly 4.5 hours. This didn't seem much for the problems ahead, but I was determined, if necessary, to cut down to 2 liters a minute for the homeward trip. I was greatly encouraged to find how, even at 28,700 feet and with no oxygen, I could work out, slowly but clearly, the problems of mental arithmetic that the oxygen supply demanded. A correct answer was imperative. Any mistake could well mean a trip with no return. But we had no time to waste. I stood up and took a series of photographs in every direction, then thrust my camera back into its warm home inside my clothing. I heaved my now pleasantly light oxygen load onto my back and connected up my tubes. I did the same for Tenzing, and we were ready to go. I asked Tenzing to belay me, and then with a growing air of excitement, I cut a broad and safe line of steps down to the snow saddle below the south summit. I wanted an easy route when we came back up here, weak and tired. Tenzing came down the steps and joined me, and then belayed once again. I moved along onto the steep snow slope on the left side of the ridge. With the first blow of my ice axe, my excitement increased. The snow, to my astonishment, was crystalline and hard. A couple of rhythmical blows of the ice axe produced a step that was big enough even for our oversized, high-altitude boots. But best of all, the steps were strong and safe. A little conscious of the great drops beneath me, I chopped a line of steps for the full length of the rope, 40 feet, and then forced the shaft of my ice axe firmly into the snow. It made a fine belay, and I looped the rope around it. I waved to Tenzing to join me, and as he moved slowly and carefully along the steps, I took in the rope as I went on cutting steps. It was exhilarating work. The summit ridge of Everest, the crisp snow, and the smooth, easy blows of the ice axe all combined to make me feel a greater sense of power than I had ever felt at great altitudes before. I went on cutting for rope length after rope length. We were now approaching a point where one of the great cornices was encroaching onto our slope. We'd have to go down to the rocks to avoid it. I cut a line of steps steeply down the slope to a small ledge on top of the rocks. There wasn't much room, but it made a reasonably safe stance. I waved to Tenzing to join me. As he came down to me, I realized there was something wrong with him. I had been so absorbed in the technical problems of the ridge that I hadn't thought much about Tenzing except for a vague feeling that he seemed to move along the steps with unnecessary slowness. But now it was quite obvious that he was not only moving extremely slowly, but was breathing quickly and with difficulty and was in considerable distress. I immediately suspected his oxygen set and helped him down onto the ledge so that I could examine it. The first thing I noticed was that from the outlet of his face mask, there were hanging some long icicles. I looked at it more closely and found that the outlet tube, about 2 inches in diameter, was almost completely blocked up with ice. This was preventing Tenzing from exhaling freely and must have made it extremely unpleasant for him. Fortunately, the outlet tube was made of rubber, and by manipulating this with my hand, I was able to release all of the ice and let it fall out. The valve started operating, and Tenzing was given immediate relief. Just as a check, I examined my own set, and found that it too had partly frozen up in the outlet tube, but not sufficiently to have affected me a great deal. I removed the ice out of it without a great deal of trouble. Automatically, I looked at our pressure gauges, just over 2,900 pounds. 2,900 pounds was just over 700 liters. 180 into 700 was about 4. We had nearly 4 hours endurance left. That meant we weren't going badly. I looked at the route ahead. The next piece wasn't going to be easy. Our rock ledge was perched right on top of the enormous bluff running down into the western combe. In fact, almost under my feet, I could see the dirty patch on the floor of the combe, which I knew was Camp 4. In a sudden urge to escape our isolation, I waved and shouted, then as suddenly stopped as I realized my foolishness. Against the vast expanse of Everest, 8,000 feet above them, we'd be quite invisible to the best binoculars. I turned back to the problem ahead. The rock was far too steep to attempt to drop down and go around this pitch. The only thing to do was to try and shuffle along the ledge and cut handholds in the bulging ice that was trying to push me off it. Held on a tight rope by Tenzing, I cut a few handholds and then thrust my ice axe as hard as I could into the solid snow and ice. Using this to take my weight, I moved quickly along the ledge. It proved easier than I had anticipated. A few more handholds, another quick swing across them, and I was able to cut a line of steps up onto a safe slope and chop out a roomy terrace from which to belay Tenzing as he climbed up to me. We were now fast approaching the most formidable obstacle on the ridge, a great rock step. This step had always been visible in aerial photographs, and in 1951, on the Everest reconnaissance, we had seen it quite clearly, with glasses, from Thiongbos. We had always thought of it as the obstacle on the ridge, which could well spell defeat. I cut a line of steps across the last snow slope, and then commenced traversing over a steep rock slab that led to the foot of the great step. The holds were small and hard to see, and I brushed my snow glasses away from my eyes. Immediately, I was blinded by a bitter wind sweeping across the ridge and laden with particles of ice. I hastily replaced my glasses and blinked away the ice and tears until I could see again. But it made me realize how efficient was our clothing in protecting us from the rigors of even a fine day at 29,000 feet. Still half blinded, I climbed across the slab and then dropped down into a tiny snow hollow at the foot of the step. And here Tenzing slowly joined me. I looked anxiously up at the rocks. Planted squarely across the ridge in a vertical bluff, they looked extremely difficult, and I knew that our strength and ability to climb steep rock at this altitude would be severely limited. I examined the route out to the left. By dropping 50 or 100 feet over steep slabs, we might be able to get around the bottom of the bluff, but there was no indication that we'd be able to climb back onto the ridge again. And to lose any height now might be fatal. Search as I could, I was unable to see an easy route up to the step, or in fact, any route at all. Finally, in desperation, I examined the right-hand end of the bluff. Attached to this, and overhanging the precipitous east face, was a large cornice. This cornice, in preparation for its inevitable crash down the mountainside, had started to lose its grip on the rock, and a long, narrow, vertical crack had been formed between the rock and the ice. The crack was large enough to take the human frame, and though it offered little security, it was at least a route. I quickly made up my mind. Tenzing had an excellent belay, and we must be near the top. It was worth a try. Before attempting the pitch, I produced my camera once again. I had no confidence that I would be able to climb this crack, and with a surge of competitive pride, which unfortunately afflicts even mountaineers, I determined to have proof that at least we had reached a good deal higher than the south summit. I took a few photographs and then made another rapid check of the oxygen. 2,500 pounds pressure. 2,550 from 3,300 leaves 750. 750 is about 2 over 9. 2 over 9 off 800 liters leaves about 600 liters. 600 divided by 180 is nearly 3.5. 3.5 hours to go. I examined Tenzing's belay to make sure it was a good one, and then slowly crawled inside the crack. In front of me was the rock wall, vertical but with a few promising holds. Behind me was the ice wall of the cornice, glittering and hard, but cracked and there. I took a hold on the rock in front and then jammed one of my crampons hard into the ice behind. Leaning back with my oxygen set on the ice, I slowly levered myself upward. Searching feverishly with my spare boot, I found a tiny ledge on the rock and took some of the weight off my other leg. Leaning back on the cornice, I fought to regain my breath. Constantly at the back of my mind was the fear that the cornice might break off, and my nerves were taut with suspense. But slowly, I forced my way up, wriggling and jamming and using every little hold. In one place, I managed to force my ice axe into a crack in the ice, and it gave me the necessary purchase to get over a holdless stretch. And then I found a solid foothold in a hollow in the ice, and next moment I was reaching over the top of the rock and pulling myself to safety. The rope came tight. Its 40 feet had been barely enough. I lay on the little rock ledge, panting furiously. Gradually it dawned on me that I was up the step, and I felt a glow of pride and determination that completely subdued my temporary feeling of weakness. For the first time on the whole expedition, I really knew I was going to get to the top. It will have to be pretty tough to stop us now, was my thought. But I couldn't entirely ignore the feeling of astonishment and wonder that I'd been able to get up such a difficulty at 29,000 feet, even without oxygen. When I was breathing more evenly, I stood and, leaning over the ledge, waved to Tenzing to come up. He moved into the crack, and I gathered in the rope and took some of his weight. Then he, in turn, commenced to struggle and jam and force his way up, until I was able to pull him to safety, gasping for breath. We rested for a moment. Above us, the ridge continued on as before, enormous overhanging cornices on the right, and steep snow slopes on the left running down to the rock bluffs. But the angle of the snow slopes was easing off. I went on chipping a line of steps, but thought it safe enough for us to move together in order to save time. The ridge rose up in a great series of snake-like undulations, which bore away to the right, each one concealing the next. I had no idea where the top was. I'd cut a line of steps around the side of one undulation, and another would come into view. We were getting desperately tired now, and Tenzing was going very slowly. I'd been cutting steps for almost 2 hours, and my back and arms were starting to tire. I tried cramponing along the slope without cutting steps, but my feet slipped uncomfortably down the slope. I went on cutting. We seemed to have been going for a very long time, and my confidence was fast evaporating. Bump followed bump with maddening regularity. A patch of shingle barred our way, and I climbed dully up it and started cutting steps around another bump. And then I realized that this was the last bump. For ahead of me, the ridge dropped steeply away in a great corniced curve, and out in the distance, I could see the pastel shades and fleecy clouds of the highlands of Tibet. To my right, a slender snow ridge climbed up to a snowy dome about 40 feet above our heads. But all the way along the ridge, the thought had haunted me that the summit might be the crest of a cornice. It was too late to take risks now. I asked Tenzing to belay me strongly, and I started cutting a cautious line of steps up the ridge. Peering from side to side and thrusting with my ice axe, I tried to discover a possible cornice, but everything seemed solid and firm. I waved Tenzing up to me. A few more whacks of the ice axe, a few very weary steps, and we were on the summit of Everest. It was 11:30 a.m. My first sensation was one of relief. Relief that the long grind was over, that the summit had been reached before our oxygen supplies had dropped to a critical level, and relief that in the end, the mountain had been kind to us in having a pleasantly rounded cone for its summit instead of a fearsome and unapproachable cornice. But mixed with the relief was a vague sense of astonishment that I could have been the lucky one to attain the ambition of so many brave and determined climbers. It seemed difficult at first to grasp that we'd got there. I was too tired and too conscious of the long way down to safety really to feel any great elation. But as the fact of our success thrust itself more clearly into my mind, I felt a quiet glow of satisfaction spread through my body. A satisfaction less vociferous, but more powerful than I had ever felt on a mountaintop before. I turned and looked at Tenzing. Even beneath his oxygen mask and the icicles hanging from his hair, I could see his infectious grin of sheer delight.